Ancient ships crossed oceans without any compass. For centuries, mariners from the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the vast Pacific undertook voyages that seem impossible to us. Polynesian explorers settled islands scattered across millions of square miles of open sea. Roman merchants sailed direct routes to India and back. They did all of this long before the magnetic compass became a common tool in the West. How did they not get hopelessly lost? The answer is far more fascinating than a single gadget. It was a complete, integrated system of human knowledge, sharp observation, and adapted technology. By the end of this exploration, you will understand the precise methods that made these epic journeys not just possible, but repeatable. We will unravel how they read the sky as a map, how they felt direction in the waves, and how they built ships that could listen to the sea. What does it say about us that we have forgotten how to navigate the world with our own senses? Their entire world was a map written in light. For ancient mariners, the sky was not a distant ceiling but a living, turning compass. It was the first and most reliable system they possessed. Long before they ever stepped aboard a ship, people on land had already spent generations watching the heavens, noting the precise points where certain stars rose and set along the horizon. This was the bedrock of all open ocean navigation. They learned that while great arcs, a handful hold steady. In the northern hemisphere, one star in particular became the unmoving anchor of the night sky. Polaris, the North Star, sits almost directly above the Earth's North Pole. It does not rise or set like the others. Instead, it remains fixed, a brilliant pivot point around which the entire northern sky appears to slowly rotate. To find it, sailors would look for the familiar shape of the Big Dipper, using its two pointer stars to trace a line directly to Polaris. Once found, they knew true north. It was a constant they could trust, a celestial landmark that never failed. But what about sailors in the southern hemisphere, where Polaris dips below the horizon and vanishes? There, navigators turn to another constellation, the Southern Cross. While it does rotate around the southern celestial pole, its long axis points toward that pole. By visualizing a point in the dark sky south of the cross, and then measuring the angle between that point and the horizon, a skilled observer could determine their southern latitude. This is the crucial insight. The height of a guiding star above the horizon, its altitude, tells you how far north or south you are. If Polaris appears directly overhead, you are at the North Pole. If it sits on the horizon, you are at the equator. Every position in between corresponds to a specific angle. By day, the sun performed the same duty. Its path across the sky, highest at noon, provided both direction and a rough sense of latitude. At night, the moon and even the bright planets like Venus served as secondary guides. This was not magic. It was rigorous observational science passed down through song, story, and direct apprenticeship. A navigator knew the star path, the sequence of constellations that would rise and set as they sailed toward a particular island. They were not just sailing on water, they were sailing beneath a grand, predictable clockwork of stars, using its consistency to conquer the chaos of the open sea. But the stars vanish with the dawn. When the sky turned blue, ancient navigators traded one set of tools for another, reading the sun with the same intimate precision. They understood that the sun was not a random wanderer. It followed a strict, predictable highway from east to west, and its exact path told them everything they needed to know. The most critical moment came each day at local noon, when the sun reached its highest point in the sky, directly to the south for those in the northern hemisphere, or to the north for those below the equator. This zenith point was their true north-south line, a solar meridian painted across the world every single day. By observing the sun's position at this apex, a sailor could instantly reorient themselves, correcting any drift from the night's course. But they didn't just wait for noon. From sunrise, they watched the sun's arc, knowing its morning position in the east and its afternoon path toward the west gave them a constant directional frame. They read shadows like text. A simple stick planted vertically in the ground, called a gnomon, became a sophisticated solar instrument. The shadow it cast was longest at sunrise and sunset, pointing directly west at dawn and directly east at dusk. As the sun climbed, the shadow shortened, rotating around the base of the stick. By marking the shadow's tip at different times, a navigator could trace the sun's journey, finding that shortest shadow at local noon, which pointed unequivocally north-south. This was more than just finding direction. The length and angle of that noon shadow changed with the seasons. A longer shadow meant the sun was lower in the sky, indicating the winter solstice was near. A shorter, almost non-existent shadow at noon meant the sun was nearly overhead, signaling the summer solstice or that the observer was near the equator. This simple stick allowed them to gauge not only their cardinal direction, but also their approximate latitude and the time of year. They were, in essence, carrying a portable, living calendar and compass made of nothing but wood and sunlight. This solar knowledge was deeply woven into their daily rhythm, turning the passage of day into a continuous, silent dialogue with their position on the planet. It meant that even under a blank blue sky, they were never truly lost, guided by the oldest clock in the world, burning brightly overhead. Yet the most sophisticated celestial navigation system ever devised did not come from parchment charts or metal instruments. It was held entirely in memory, perfected over generations by the Polynesian voyagers of the Pacific Ocean. Their mental model of the sky was so precise it formed a living compass, one that could guide a canoe across thousands of miles of trackless water to find an island smaller than a speck on the horizon. This was the star compass, a conceptual masterpiece. Imagine the horizon as a great circle surrounding your canoe. Now, divide that circle into 32 equal segments, like the points on a traditional compass rows, but instead of north, south, east, and west, each segment is named for a specific star or constellation that rises or sets there. For a navigator from the Caroline Islands, for instance, the rising point of the star Altair was one house. The setting point of the Southern Cross marked another. The navigator memorized not just the star, but the exact spot on the watery rim of the world where it would first appear each evening or make its final descent at dawn. This created a permanent, unwavering grid of direction locked to the cosmos. As the Earth turned through the night, different stars would move into and out of these designated houses, but the houses themselves never moved. So if your destination lay in the house of the rising Pleiades, you simply kept your canoe oriented so that those stars continued to climb directly ahead of you. If clouds obscured your guide star, you could glance to the side houses, using the stars rising at 90 degrees to your course to check for lateral drift. This system was brilliantly resilient because it was based on the fixed geometry of the celestial sphere. It was completely unaffected by magnetic anomalies that would pull our iron needle off course. There was no deviation to calculate, no instrument to fail. The knowledge was carried in chants and stories, taught through years of apprenticeship on long voyages. A master navigator, or PWO, could lie in the hull of his vessel, feeling its motion, and mentally track his position across the ocean by the procession of stars through their celestial houses overhead. He was not sailing toward an island he could see. He was sailing beneath a dome of stars, each one a familiar guidepost on a highway he knew by heart, trusting that this star road, etched into his mind, would lead him home. But a star compass alone could not tell you how far you had traveled. For that, ancient mariners relied on a different kind of art, one born from relentless attention to the ship itself. This was the practice of dead reckoning, a continuous and vital calculation of position based on movement. The term itself comes from an old nautical phrase, deduced reckoning, and it was the engine that powered voyages between celestial fixes. At its heart, dead reckoning is a simple formula. You start from a known point, you note the direction you sail, you estimate your speed, you keep track of the time, and you plot where you should be. The brilliance lay not in the math but in the profound feel required for each variable. Direction was maintained by that constant celestial watch, keeping the guiding star on the correct bearing. But speed was a matter of deep, almost intuitive experience. There were no mechanical logs. A navigator knew his vessel's song, the specific sound and rhythm of water rushing past the hull at different paces. He observed the wake, the pattern of bubbles and foam streaming behind. He felt the vessel's response to the wind, noting the angle of the sail and the heel of the deck. From a lifetime on the water, he could estimate speed with surprising accuracy, categorizing it into levels like walking pace, trotting, or a full run. Time was the other crucial element. In daylight, the sun's passage provided a clock. At night, they used the movement of the stars, noting when certain constellations reached certain positions in their nightly arc. On longer voyages, they might employ simple timekeepers like calibrated sandglasses or water clocks, though these were rare and precious. With these two pieces, estimated speed and elapsed time, they could calculate distance. If you sail at what feels like a steady trot, about 6 miles in an hour for 10 hours, you have covered 60 miles. Plot that distance along your star bearing on a mental chart, and you have a new estimated position. This was their living map, constantly updated in the navigator's mind, yet they understood its fundamental weakness. Every estimate carried a small error. A slight misjudgment of speed, a subtle current pushing the ship sideways, a wind shift unnoticed in the night. These tiny errors accumulated, causing the dead reckoning position to drift, sometimes dangerously, from true reality. This is why celestial fixes were so essential. They were the resets, spotting a known star at its expected height, or finally seeing a landmark, would correct the accumulated drift of days. Dead reckoning was the brave act of navigating through the unknown, trusting skill and sense to bridge the vast gaps between the unmoving stars. It was an art of disciplined estimation, a testament to human attention holding a tiny, moving dot of consciousness steady on a trackless sea. The open sea is never truly still. Beneath the choppy surface and the capricious wind lies a deeper, more reliable rhythm, a slow, powerful heartbeat of the ocean itself. This is the swell, the great rolling waves generated by distant weather systems and steady trade winds that can travel for thousands of miles. For the master navigators of the Pacific, these swells were not just motion to be endured. They were a tactile map, a constant stream of directional information felt through the hull of the canoe. Even on a calm, windless day with a featureless horizon, the long, deep undulations of the primary swell continued their march. A navigator lying down in the vessel could feel the precise angle at which these rollers lifted and dropped his craft. By aligning his body with the pulse of the ocean, he could maintain a steady course relative to that swell, using it as a vast, aquatic compass needle pointing toward a consistent origin. The true artistry, however, lay in reading the subtle interference patterns. A single dominant swell is like a straight road, but when that road meets an obstacle, like a distant island or a submerged reef, it bends. The swell refracts, wrapping around the landmass and creating a secondary, confused pattern of waves intersecting the main set. Long before any peak of land broke the horizon, a skilled navigator could detect this subtle signature in the vessel's motion, a slight hesitation, a cross ripple, a gentle rebounding echo in the water. He was literally feeling the presence of land over the horizon through the language of waves. He could distinguish the steady, deep rhythm of the open ocean swell from the shorter, steeper chop generated by local winds. He learned to identify the specific swell patterns that meant the trade winds were steady from the northeast, or that a storm far to the south was sending its energy his way. This knowledge was often tested in the most critical phase of a voyage, the landfall. Sailing directly toward a small island was incredibly difficult. You could easily sail right past it in the vastness. Instead, navigators would purposefully aim to intercept the island's swell shadow, that zone of disturbed water. Once they felt the pattern shift, they would turn, following the bent waves like a trail of breadcrumbs directly to the shore. It was navigation by kinesthetic sense, by becoming one with the ocean's pulse. The canoe was not just a vehicle. It was a sensitive instrument, its every shudder and glide a word in a silent conversation between the sailor and the sea. The sky and sea spoke in a constant dialogue of signs, and the most attentive navigators learned to read every whisper. Beyond the stars and swells, they turned their gaze upward to the ever-changing canvas of the clouds, finding in their shapes and colors the faint, reflected image of distant land. A stationary, puffy cumulus cloud that seemed anchored to one spot on the horizon, especially on an otherwise clear day, was not a random formation. It was often a cloud tower, formed when moist air rising from a warm island or atoll reached a cooler altitude and condensed. That lone cloud could mark an invisible island dozens of miles away, a beacon in the blue. Even more telling was a subtle greenish or turquoise tint in the underside of such clouds, a phenomenon known as loom. This was sunlight reflecting off the shallow, light-colored lagoons and coral sands of an atoll, casting its hue onto the cloud base above. To a navigator, that faint wash of color in the sky was as clear a signpost as a painted arrow on a road, pointing directly to fresh water and shelter. But the most dynamic guides were not in the water or the air. They were the creatures that bridged both worlds. Seabirds became living compasses and range finders. Navigators paid close attention to specific species, knowing their habits intimately. Birds like the booby or the tern would fly out from their island nests at dawn to fish in the rich offshore waters, but they possessed a crucial limitation. They had to return to land by nightfall. This created a daily pattern of immense navigational value. If a sailor spotted a bird flying in a steady, purposeful direction late in the afternoon, it was almost certainly heading home to roost. By noting its flight path, a navigator gained a direct bearing to land. Even more precisely, they knew the maximum range of different birds. A small white tern might only venture 20 or 30 miles from its nest. Spotting one of these at sea meant you were within that radius of an island. A larger frigate bird, however, could range over 100 miles. Identifying the species told you not just the direction to land, but also the scale of your search. At the critical moment of a long voyage, seeing a line of birds returning at dusk was like seeing the lights of a distant city appear one by one, each one confirming the path and shortening the remaining distance in the mind. The ocean was never empty. It was a living network of relationships where cloud and creature alike carried messages about the unseen earth, turning the entire environment into a vast, interactive chart for those who knew how to look. Yet all of these grand techniques for crossing the void rested upon a foundation of intimate, local knowledge. Before a navigator could trust himself to the stars, he first had to master the language of the shoreline. This was the art of piloting, a meticulous study of everything that could be seen, touched, and felt in coastal waters. It served as the indispensable training ground where abstract concepts of direction and position were made concrete and tested daily. The most fundamental tool in this craft was astonishingly simple, a length of rope with a weight at its end. The lead line was the navigator's probe into the unseen world beneath his keel. He would stand at the rail, swing the lead out ahead of the moving vessel, and let it sink. When it hit bottom, the line would go slack in his hands. By feeling the marks tied into the rope at regular intervals, he knew the exact depth, but he learned to read more than just depth, the bottom of the weight was hollowed out and packed with tallow or grease. When he hauled the line back up, the sample of seabed that stuck to that grease told a vivid story. Clean white sand meant one kind of coastline, perhaps an open beach. Sticky gray mud indicated a river estuary or a sheltered bay. Small shells or broken corals spoke of specific underwater shelves or reefs. By charting a mental map of these changing bottoms, a pilot could navigate through fog or darkness, knowing his position by the texture of the seafloor alone. He was literally feeling his way along the submerged contours of the land. Above the water, his eyes catalogued every detail. A peculiarly shaped hill that lined up with a notch in a distant cliff became a transit, a natural alignment that marked a safe channel. A lone, gnarled tree on a headland, a distinctive rock pillar, even the pattern of breakers over a hidden shoal, all were committed to memory as sea marks. These were the signposts of the coastal highway. He learned the rhythm of the tides, knowing that a certain rock would be exposed at low water to show the way, or that a fierce current would slacken at the turn of the tide, granting a narrow window for a safe passage. This constant, granular attention to the immediate environment trained his mind for the open ocean. Reading the subtle shift in a swell pattern out of sight of land required the same observational muscle as spotting a change in the color of the water over a shoal. Estimating speed for dead reckoning was refined by countless trips along a known coast, where he could check his guesses against fixed landmarks. The star compass was a magnificent abstraction, but it was first understood by relating the rising points of those stars to familiar headlands and bays back home. Mastery of the visible, tangible coast taught him how to interpret the invisible clues of the deep sea. It was here, in the complicated, crowded waters near shore, that he learned to listen, to feel, and to trust his senses, building the unshakable confidence needed to later point his bow toward a horizon with no land at all. The ocean possessed a great, breathing rhythm, and ancient sailors learned its schedule by heart. Beyond reading the stars or the swells, they mastered the most powerful force of all, the wind itself. They did not see wind as a random obstacle or a simple push, but as a vast, predictable highway system with its own strict timetable. This was wind lore, the knowledge of seasonal patterns that turned the open sea from a treacherous barrier into a navigable route. In the Mediterranean, Greek and Roman mariners timed their voyages around the Artesian winds, steady northerlies that blew like clockwork each summer. These were not storms but reliable engines. A merchant planning a trip from Egypt to Rome knew that if he set sail in July, these winds would fill his sails and carry him directly across the sea. He was, in essence, sailing the calendar, his departure date dictated by an atmospheric certainty written into the very fabric of the year. But the ultimate expression of this knowledge was found in the Indian Ocean, governed by the mighty monsoon system. For half the year, from April to September, the southwest monsoon blows steadily from Africa toward India, bringing with it heavy rains. Then, as if a global switch is flipped, the winds reverse from October to March, with the northeast monsoon flowing from Asia back toward Africa. This was not a subtle shift, it was a complete transformation of the seascape, and entire economies were built upon its predictability. Arab and Indian traders did not fight these winds. They designed their entire commercial year around them. A ship laden with spices would catch the southwest monsoon from the Arabian coast to India, arriving with the rains. After trading and waiting through the turbulent shift, it would catch the returning northeast monsoon home, its hold now full of textiles and gems. The voyage was a grand, annual round trip powered by the planet's own breathing. This deep understanding meant that navigation was as much about patience and planning as it was about skill at sea. To set sail against the monsoon was considered foolish, often disastrous. The wind was more than a force, it was a partner, a guide with a known mind. By aligning their journeys with these immense natural cycles, sailors transformed what we might see as a limitation into their greatest strategic advantage. They were not just crossing water, they were riding the arteries of the Earth's climate, harnessing seasons to span oceans. Beneath the wind, the ocean itself was moving. Great rivers of seawater, wider than continents and deeper than mountains, flowed with a silent, persistent force. These were the currents, and to ancient mariners they were both powerful allies and subtle adversaries that had to be understood completely. The most famous of these highways, like the North Equatorial Current in the Atlantic or the mighty Agulhas Current sweeping down the eastern coast of Africa, were not just features on a map. They were living forces that could have a journey's time or, if ignored, dash a ship hopelessly off course. A captain sailing from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic might deliberately catch the Canary Current flowing south along Africa's coast, using its steady push to aid his passage before turning west to harness the North Equatorial Current for the long Atlantic crossing. This was not passive drifting. It was active, strategic engagement with the ocean's own conveyor belt, a calculated decision to let the planet's circulatory system do a portion of the work. But this assistance came with a cost that demanded constant vigilance. Every current, no matter how helpful, introduced a hidden variable into the delicate math of dead reckoning. If you were sailing east but a strong current was pushing you north, your actual track over the seabed was a diagonal, not the straight line your compass bearing suggested. Uncompensated, this could lead to a catastrophic error, leaving you searching for an island that was now dozens of miles to your side. The navigator's genius lay in detecting and measuring this invisible drift. One method was the ancient precursor to the chip log. By dropping a floating object overboard at the bow and timing how long it took to drift past the stern, a sailor could estimate the current's set and drift relative to his ship. It was a simple experiment that yielded vital data, allowing him to adjust his mental chart plotting. The ocean itself offered other, more subtle signs of a current's presence. A sharp line on the water's surface where the color changed from deep blue to a murky green could mark the boundary between two great masses of moving water, a frontier visible only to the trained eye. A sudden shift in water temperature, felt by hand or noted by a change in the condensation on storage jars below deck, signaled that the ship had crossed into a different flow. On dark nights, the most magical sign might appear. Patches of bioluminescence stirred by the ship's passage could glow with an eerie light. But if that glowing trail did not stream directly behind the ship, instead angling off into the darkness, it was a ghostly map of the current's true direction, painting the hidden flow in streaks of living light. To navigate was to engage in a continuous dialogue with these layers of movement, separating the wind's push from the water's pull, constantly correcting for the silent river in which you sailed. The senses of hearing and smell became long-range scouts for the ancient mariner. In the deep silence of a fog-shrouded morning, or on a moonless night when the stars were veiled, the first sign of land might not be seen at all, but heard. The low, rhythmic thunder of surf breaking against a distant reef or a cliff-lined shore could carry for miles over calm water. This was not a chaotic noise, but a signature. A seasoned navigator learned to distinguish the booming crash of waves against a solid headland from the softer, more diffuse roar of breakers spilling over a submerged coral shelf. The sound's direction, volume, and even its tone painted an auditory picture of the coastline still hidden beyond the horizon, allowing him to steer toward safe passage or away from a deadly lee shore. Even more subtle was the information carried on the breeze itself. Long before the eye could discern a blur of green, the nose might catch a hint of the distant earth. In the vast Pacific, where atolls are crowned with dense groves of flowering trees like the pandanus and gardenia, their sweet, heavy fragrance could be carried far out to sea by a steady wind. The smell of damp soil after a rain, the smoky scent of a cooking fire from a village, or the distinct muddy odor of a mangrove swamp all served as olfactory beacons. These smells were faint threads in the vastness, but to a crew who had tasted nothing but salt spray for weeks, they were as startling and clear as a shout. In archipelago environments, like the islands of Greece or Indonesia, where land was often a chain of specks across the water, these sensory cues were woven into the navigator's decision-making. The sudden scent of blossoms might confirm they were on the correct bearing toward a lush, high island, while the smell of smoke could indicate not just land but human habitation, guiding them toward a welcome harbor. It was a form of navigation that engaged the whole body and mind, treating the ocean not as an empty space, but as a medium that carried the full spectrum of a land's presence, its sight, its sound, and even its scent, waiting to be decoded by those patient enough to listen and to breathe deeply. A ship was more than just a floating platform for a navigator. It was his primary instrument, a physical extension of his own senses, engineered over generations to translate intention into motion across the sea. The connection between shipbuilding and navigation was absolute. Every curve of the hull, every line of the rigging, was a calculated response to the wind and waves, designed to give the vessel predictable, reliable behavior. This predictability was the unsung hero of open ocean navigation, turning the chaotic forces of nature into a manageable dialogue. Consider the hull. In the Mediterranean, the Greeks and Romans developed long, narrow galleys with shallow drafts powered primarily by banks of oars. These were coastal sprinters, designed for agility in confined waters and predictable summer winds. But for the open Atlantic, the Norse built their iconic longships with a profoundly different philosophy. Their hulls were clinker-built, with overlapping planks that created a flexible, resilient shell. The keel was a deep, sturdy backbone, and the hull shape was symmetrical at both ends. This design was not an accident. It allowed the ship to pivot easily, to be beached on any shore, and most crucially, to maintain directional stability when running before a gale or sailing across a steep swell. A Norse skipper knew exactly how his ship would answer the helm in a following sea, a vital predictability for dead reckoning across the North Atlantic's moody expanse. The sail told a similar story. The simple square sail of antiquity, effective for running before the steady trade winds or monsoon, gave way to more sophisticated shapes in places where winds were variable. The lateen sail, a triangular rig adopted from the Arab world into the Mediterranean, was a revolution in control. It could be set to catch winds from angles a square sail could not, allowing a vessel to sail closer to the wind, to tack and maneuver in confined channels. This meant a navigator was less at the mercy of a wind's exact direction. He could hold a course even if the wind shifted slightly, maintaining his intended bearing for his dead reckoning calculations. The final piece of this integrated system was the steering apparatus itself. For centuries, the dominant technology was the steering oar, a large paddle mounted on the starboard or steer-board side of the vessel. Its effectiveness depended entirely on the water flowing past it. In a fast-moving ship, a light touch could change course. In a slow drift, it was almost useless. The invention of the stern-mounted rudder, attached directly to the ship's keel, was a transformative leap. It provided vastly superior leverage and control, especially in heavy seas. Now a helmsman could hold a steady course against a cross swell or a gusting side wind with less physical strain and more precision. This mechanical reliability directly translated to navigational accuracy. A ship that wandered off course due to poor steering introduced massive error into the dead reckoning plot. A ship that tracked straight and true, responding predictably to the helm, made the navigator's mental calculations far more trustworthy. The vessel itself, therefore, was the first and most important piece of navigational technology. It was a crafted response to a specific environment, designed not just to survive the sea, but to communicate with it clearly, turning the sailor's will into a straight, knowable line across the deep. This integrated system of knowledge was not just theory, it was proven on some of history's most daring voyages. For a perfect case study, we look to the masters of the Bronze Age Mediterranean, the Phoenicians. From their coastal city-states like Tyre and Sidon, these merchant mariners built a trade network that stretched across the known world, and their reputation for secrecy was legendary. They guarded their sea routes as state secrets, and for good reason. Their most astonishing journeys took them far beyond the safe, sun-drenched waters of their home sea, out past the Pillars of Hercules, what we call the Strait of Gibraltar, and into the terrifying vastness of the Atlantic Ocean. Ancient sources tell us they sailed south along the coast of Africa, perhaps even circumnavigating the continent on a multi-year voyage commissioned by an Egyptian pharaoh. They established a trading post at Tartessos in Spain, a source of precious silver, and some tales even suggest they reached the tin-rich islands of Britain. These were not pleasure cruises, they were high-stakes commercial expeditions into literal terra incognita, where getting lost meant financial ruin and almost certain loss of life. So how did they do it centuries before the compass? Their toolkit was a masterful blend of all the methods we have discussed, applied with ruthless pragmatism. Celestial navigation was certainly part of their arsenal. Sailing south along the African coast, they would have watched the familiar northern stars like Polaris sink lower toward the horizon, while new, unfamiliar southern constellations rose before them. This changing sky provided a constant, if unsettling, measure of their latitude, but the stars were not always visible. The Atlantic is famously moody, with long periods of overcast skies. Here, the Phoenicians' true expertise shone, their deep, granular knowledge of piloting. Before venturing into the open ocean, they spent generations mastering the Mediterranean coastline. They knew every safe harbor, every freshwater spring, every distinctive mountain peak that could serve as a transit marker. This foundational skill scaled up. For their Atlantic voyages, they likely clung to the coastline whenever possible, using the same piloting techniques on a continental scale. They would have memorized the sequence of capes, river mouths, and changes in coastal geology, turning the entire shoreline of Iberia and Africa into a linear sequence of sea marks. But what about when even the coast faded into haze or distance? This is where their most valuable asset came into play, not a tool, but a set of instructions. They likely relied on detailed, memorized sailing directions, what the Greeks later called a periplus. These were not maps, but narratives. A sailing master would have learned a verbal route description passed down from captain to captain. It would have sounded something like this: sail west from the Pillars for 3 days until you see the high, red cliffs. Then turn south, keeping the setting sun on your left until you smell the cedar forests after 5 days. Then look for the river with the twin peaks inland where the current runs strong. Anchor there. These directions wove together everything: wind patterns that could be counted on at certain seasons, the flight paths of coastal birds, the smell of distant vegetation, the sound of breakers on specific shoals, and the depth and composition of the seabed. They were living databases of sensory information, allowing them to navigate under overcast skies by following a story where every chapter was a sensory clue confirming they were on the right path. Their success was built on this layered redundancy: the stars for open water verification, the coast for detailed piloting, and the memorized oral map for everything in between, a testament to human memory and observation conquering a world without instruments. Their most audacious journeys would have been impossible without a vessel that was itself a masterpiece of engineering. The Polynesian voyaging canoe, or Wakolua, was not merely a boat, it was a self-contained world designed to sustain life and hope for weeks on the open ocean. At first glance, its design seems almost counterintuitive. Instead of one deep hull, it featured two long, slender hulls carved from massive logs and lashed together with miles of resilient coconut fiber rope. This twin-hull configuration was the secret to its legendary stability. A single hull in rough seas can roll violently, exhausting the crew and making navigation nearly impossible. But two hulls, spaced apart by a solid platform, created a wide base that resisted capsizing, riding over swells rather than cutting through them. This stability was not just about comfort, it was a navigational necessity. It provided a steady, level platform from which the navigator could observe the stars, feel the subtle patterns of the swells, and maintain his concentration for days on end. The platform between the hulls, often covered by a thatched shelter, served as the living space. Here, families and crews would live, cook, and store the provisions that made long-distance colonization feasible. They carried dried fish, fermented breadfruit, coconuts, and sweet potatoes, along with seedlings and even young animals in cages, everything needed to start a new life on an undiscovered shore. This cargo capacity transformed the canoe from an exploratory vessel into an ark, carrying an entire ecosystem and the future of a community across the void. But perhaps its most brilliant feature was its sail plan. The canoe was rigged with a single, massive crab claw sail, a triangular shape with a pronounced curve. This was not a sail for timid sailing. It was designed for power and, crucially, for sailing across the wind, a point of sail known as reaching. A simple square sail is efficient when the wind is directly behind you, pushing you forward. But what if your target island lies not downwind, but at an angle to the wind? The crab claw sail, with its aerodynamic shape, allowed the Waikolua to harness the wind's force even when it was coming from the side. This meant navigators were not slaves to the wind's direction. They could sail a vast, zig-zagging course across the prevailing trade winds, opening up a fan of possible destinations rather than being blown in a straight line. The canoe itself became a partner in the navigation. Its predictable response to the helm, its steady motion through the water, and its ability to maintain a consistent speed were all calibrated through generations of trial and error. When the navigator set his course by the rising star of Aldebaran, he could trust that his vessel would hold that bearing, its twin hulls tracking straight and true, carrying the memory of his ancestors and the future of his people toward a new horizon. The technology did not replace the navigator's profound knowledge. It completed it, providing the stable, capable vehicle that turned celestial theory into lived reality, one wave at a time. Even on days when the sun itself was a ghost behind the clouds, it may have still cast a hidden compass for the most daring sailors of the North. Among the Norse sagas, there are fleeting, enigmatic references to a magical stone, a solar stein or sunstone, used to locate the sun's position on overcast days. For centuries, this was dismissed as mere legend, but modern science has revealed a startling possibility, a natural crystal that could have functioned as a sophisticated optical aid. The candidate is a transparent calcite crystal known as Iceland spar. When you look through a clear piece of this mineral, you see a double image due to its unique property of polarizing light. Here is where the magic of physics meets ancient pragmatism. Even when the sky is a uniform, featureless gray, sunlight penetrating the cloud cover remains partially polarized, meaning its light waves vibrate in a specific orientation relative to the hidden sun. By rotating a piece of Iceland spar and observing changes in the intensity of the double images, a skilled user could pinpoint the sun's azimuth, its direction along the horizon, with remarkable accuracy. It would not tell them the time of day or the sun's altitude, but in the fog-shrouded waters near Greenland or Iceland, simply knowing east from west could mean the difference between finding a fjord and sailing into the endless ocean. This was not a standalone solution, but a brilliant complement to their other skills. On a day of thick cloud, when the horizon vanished and the sea merged with the sky into a disorienting gray void, a navigator could retreat to a sheltered spot on the deck. Holding the sunstone up to the sky, he would slowly turn it, watching the twin images of the cloud glow until they matched in brightness. That alignment pointed directly to the hidden sun. He could then mark that bearing on the ship's rail, establishing a temporary, artificial horizon and a fixed reference point to steer by. The existence of such a tool is still debated by historians, as no definitive sunstone has been found in an archaeological context linked to a Viking ship. Yet we know the Norse traded for and valued such crystals. Laboratory experiments and practical sea trials have proven the method works, even in twilight after sunset or before dawn. It represents a fascinating bridge between myth and material science, a tangible example of how ancient mariners might have leveraged a deep understanding of their environment, turning a beautiful geological curiosity into a lifeline. It suggests their toolkit was even more nuanced than we thought, blending celestial memory with a crystal's hidden whisper of light, allowing them to navigate not just by what they could see, but by what they could cleverly reveal. But even the keenest eye needed a way to measure what it saw. This desire for precision led to the creation of the first handheld navigational instruments, simple tools that quantified the sky. Centuries before the compass pointed north, sailors were already using devices to measure their place on the planet, starting with a brilliant, elegant tool from the Arab world, the camel. At its heart, the camel was nothing more than a small rectangular piece of wood or bone, about the size of a playing card, with a knotted string tied through its center. Its simplicity was its genius. To use it, a navigator would hold the camel at arm's length, its bottom edge aligned with the horizon. He would then slide the wooden plate along the string until its top edge just touched the star he was sighting, Polaris. The specific knot that met his lips or nose as he held the string taut gave him the measurement. Each knot represented a known latitude, a specific port or headland along a familiar trade route. If he was sailing from Aden to Calicut, he knew that when Polaris touched the top of the camel while the string was held at the Calicut knot, he had arrived at his destination's latitude. He would then turn east or west and sail along that line of latitude until he made landfall. This was not about finding direction, but about finding a specific line across the earth. The camel transformed the abstract concept of celestial altitude into a tangible, repeatable number, a tactile confirmation of position gleaned from the night sky. It was a personal, portable record of voyages past, each knot a memory tied into a cord. As trade routes expanded and the thirst for greater accuracy grew, this basic principle evolved into a more sophisticated tool, the cross-staff. Imagine a long, slender staff like a walking stick. Now, picture a shorter crosspiece that could slide back and forth along its length. The navigator would place one end of the main staff against his cheekbone, just below his eye. He would then slide the crosspiece until its lower end touched the horizon and its upper end touched the star. By reading markings on the main staff, he could calculate the angle between the horizon and the star with much finer precision than the camel allowed. This angle, measured in degrees, was his latitude. The cross-staff's design allowed for more consistent measurements, less dependent on the individual's arm length or posture. It represented a clear technological progression, a move from the personal, knot-based system of the camel toward a more standardized, mathematical approach to the heavens. Yet the fundamental principle remained unchanged. Both tools were extensions of the human body and eye, designed to capture a single, vital piece of data from the cosmos, the altitude of a guiding star. They were mechanical answers to a celestial question, proving that navigation was steadily becoming a quantifiable science, all while still looking up, not down at a trembling magnetic needle. This magnetic marvel, however, did not instantly make the old ways obsolete. when the knowledge of the magnetic compass slowly traveled from China along the Silk Roads of the sea, reaching the Mediterranean and Europe around the 12th century, it arrived not as a revolutionary conqueror, but as a curious and somewhat temperamental guest. On the wooden ships of the age, the early compass was a fragile thing. Its needle, a sliver of magnetized iron, was balanced on a delicate pin or floated in a bowl of water. The rolling of a ship in heavy seas could send it spinning. The very iron nails and fittings used in the ship's construction could pull the needle away from true magnetic north, a bewildering effect sailors called deviation. For a navigator who trusted the unwavering truth of Polaris, a tool that pointed to a slightly different north on different ships and wobbled with every wave, must have seemed deeply unreliable. Its true genius and its initial role was as a failsafe for the senses, under a sky choked with clouds. When the sun and stars vanished for days, the old celestial map went blank. In this gray, disorienting void, the compass provided a single, crucial constant. It could tell you which way the bow was pointing, even if you could not see where you were going. This allowed dead reckoning to continue with some confidence through the gloom, maintaining a straight line when all other reference points had dissolved. It did not and could not tell you your location. It could not measure latitude, warn of currents, or smell land on the wind. For centuries, it served as a supplemental check, a whisper of direction when the sky fell silent, integrated into the existing tapestry of knowledge but not yet dominating it. The master navigator still looked first to the stars, felt the swell, and watched the birds. The compass was kept close at hand, a small, mysterious ally for the moments when the primary language of the world could not be read. This integrated knowledge was not learned from a book or a single voyage. It was woven into a person over a lifetime, beginning in childhood and forged through a sacred apprenticeship. The path from novice to master navigator was one of total immersion, a slow transfer of a living world model from one mind to another. A young apprentice did not first learn about stars in isolation. He began by doing the most mundane tasks on a coastal canoe, feeling the vessel's every shift, learning the rhythm of the paddle, and memorizing the shapes of the shore. His teacher, the PWO or master, would point not just to a star, but to the specific spot on the horizon where it emerged from the sea, linking that celestial event to a known headland they had passed that afternoon. Every lesson was contextual, sensory, and layered. He learned to name the swells by the feel of their lift under the hull, to identify bird species by the arc of their flight at dusk, to distinguish the scent of a rain squall from the distant smell of flowering teal trees on a high island. The goal was never to memorize a list of facts, but to build an intuitive, constantly updating mental picture of the canoe's place in a dynamic web of relationships. This picture was his true chart. In the vast Pacific, this entire body of knowledge was often encoded into chants and oral traditions. These were not simple songs, but dense, rhythmic databases. A chant might list, in precise order, the sequence of star bearings for a voyage from one island to another, the names of the intervening sea currents, the species of birds to expect at certain distances, and the distinctive cloud formations over the target atoll. By reciting and internalizing these chants, the navigator carried a verbal algorithm for the journey within him. During the voyage, he would mentally tick off each segment as it was completed, the chant structuring time and progress across the void. The synthesis happened in real time, in the quiet concentration of the night watch. Lying in the hull, he would feel the dominant swell direction against his back, confirming the vessel's orientation. He would listen to the sound of water rushing past, estimating speed. He would glance up, verifying that Antares was rising just ahead of the mast, right where the chant said it should be. A sudden shift in the wind's tone might prompt him to check for a new cloud pattern to the southeast, suggesting a weather change he needed to account for in his dead reckoning. His mind was a continuous processing center, cross-referencing a dozen streams of sensory data against the remembered template of the chant. There was no single cue he trusted absolutely, for the sea was full of deception. A cloud could obscure a star, a local wind could mask the true swell, a tired mind could misremember a bearing. His expertise was in the synthesis, in the weight he gave to each piece of conflicting information, and in the calm confidence to hold a course when the clues seemed to disagree. He was not just reading the environment, he was in dialogue with it. His consciousness extended through the feel of the canoe, the smell of the air, and the map of the stars in his mind, all united into a single, unwavering sense of way. The Norse seafarers turned this principle into a brutal, efficient strategy for crossing the North Atlantic. Their method, often called latitude sailing, was less about navigating to a specific point and more about finding a line, a celestial highway drawn across the ocean's surface. Imagine a Viking captain setting out from Norway, his destination the fledgling settlement on the coast of Greenland. He would not have a chart showing Greenland's intricate fjords. Instead, he possessed a crucial piece of information, likely passed from another sailor who had made the journey: the sun's height at noon above the southern settlement. This measurement, the destination's latitude, was his entire map. His voyage became a two-stage process, brilliantly simple in concept yet demanding immense skill to execute. First, he would sail north or south from his home fjord until the sun at its midday peak matched the known altitude of his target. He might have used a simple sun's shadow board, a wooden disc with a central gnomon and concentric rings carved into it. By observing the length of the noon's shadow against these rings, he could confirm he had reached the correct celestial parallel. Once the shadow aligned, the first, most difficult part was over. He had found the line. Now he simply turned his sleek longship due west or due east for the return journey and sailed straight along that line of latitude. He no longer needed to worry about precise celestial fixes every day. His job was now to keep the sun's noon shadow constant, a relentless monitor of his east-west track. If the shadow grew longer, he had drifted too far north and must correct south. If it shortened, he had slipped south and must steer northward. The destination itself was somewhere ahead on that infinite line. His faith was placed in the sheer geography of the north, where lands were few and far between. By holding this unwavering course, he knew he would eventually strike the massive, mountainous coast of Greenland. From there, it was a matter of sailing north or south along the shoreline, using familiar piloting techniques, until he recognized the specific fjord that held his home. This method was perfectly suited to their purposes of raiding and settlement. A Viking fleet targeting the rich monasteries of northern Britain, for instance, could sail west from Denmark until they hit the latitude of Lindisfarne, then turn and cruise along that parallel until the Holy Island appeared out of the mist. It transformed the terrifying open ocean into a series of manageable, repeatable procedures. Find the line, then follow it until something solid interrupts your path. It was a testament to their pragmatic confidence, using the sun not just as a guide, but as a relentless taskmaster, holding them to a narrow road across the trackless sea until new land rose from the waves to meet them. This mastery of the wind reached its most elegant form in the Indian Ocean, where the entire sea became a seasonal highway. Here, the monsoon was not just a weather pattern, it was the architect of civilization, a force so reliable that it dictated the calendar of empires. For the Greco-Roman merchants from Egypt and the Arab traders of Oman and Yemen, crossing the open water between the Red Sea and the west coast of India was a journey of thousands of miles. To attempt it with oars or to fight against the wind would have been an exercise in futility. Instead, they learned to listen to the ocean's breath, to plan their lives around its grand, predictable reversal. From around April to September, the southwest monsoon blows steadily from the Horn of Africa across the Arabian Sea toward the Indian subcontinent. This wind is not a gentle breeze, it is a powerful, moisture-laden engine that brings the life-giving rains to India. For a merchant in the port of Berenice on the Red Sea, this was the signal. His ship, loaded with Mediterranean goods like gold, glassware, and fine wine, would catch this southwest wind. It would fill the sail and push the vessel on a direct, downwind run across the open ocean, a journey that could take about a month. There was no need to hug a coast, no need for complex tacking. The wind itself was the road, and it led straight to the Malabar coast of India, to ports like Muziris where the markets awaited. Upon arrival, the crew would trade, but they would also wait. They could not return immediately, for the wind that brought them would now be against them. So they spent months, the entire rainy season, repairing their ship, securing a cargo of precious pepper, spices, silks, and gems. Then, as if on a celestial schedule, the wind reversed. From October to March, the northeast monsoon began to blow, streaming down from the Himalayas and Central Asia, back across the Indian Ocean toward Arabia and Africa. This was their return ticket. They would raise sail and let this new wind carry them home on another direct, open water route. The entire annual cycle was a perfectly timed round trip. This was more than just convenient sailing, it was a logistical symphony. It meant ships spent minimal time at sea battling contrary conditions, which reduced risk, preserved food and water, and maximized profit. Entire trading communities, from Alexandria to Gujarat, synchronized their economic and agricultural years to this rhythm. The predictability was so absolute that contracts were written with departure and arrival dates pinned to the monsoon shifts. This system created a web of interconnected cultures where Arab navigators, Indian merchants, and Roman financiers all operated on the same shared clock, a clock set by the planet itself. They did not conquer the Indian Ocean by fighting its nature, but by understanding it so completely that they could harness its most powerful force as a reliable, renewable engine for global trade. For all their brilliance, this ancient system had one profound and dangerous blind spot. It could tell a sailor exactly how far north or south he was, but it could not tell him how far east or west he had traveled. This was the infamous problem of longitude. While latitude could be measured by the height of the sun or a star, longitude required knowing the precise difference in time between your current location and a fixed starting point. Every hour of time difference equals 15 degrees of longitude. Without an accurate, seaworthy clock to carry that home port time with you across the rolling ocean, the east-west position remained a terrifying mystery. A navigator could know he was on the correct latitude line for his island, but was he still a day's sail away, or had he already passed it in the night, leaving it somewhere behind him in the endless blue? This fundamental uncertainty forced a radical and pragmatic strategy, a deliberate dance with error known as the sailing expansion. Instead of aiming a fragile wooden ship directly at a tiny island dot, a navigator would intentionally sail to a point either well north or well south of his target. He would use his impeccable latitude skills to find this parallel, a line he knew with absolute certainty. Then, with the island safely to his east or west, he would turn and sail along that line of latitude, knowing that he could not miss. He was essentially turning a single, risky point of arrival into a long, safe line of discovery. Imagine searching for a specific house on a dark street, but instead of walking straight to where you think it is, you first walk to the end of the block. You then turn onto the street, knowing the house must be somewhere along that entire row. You have traded precision for certainty. For a Polynesian voyager seeking a new atoll, this might mean sailing until the North Star told him he was 2 degrees north of his destination's known latitude. He would then turn his canoe due east, knowing the island lay somewhere along that eastward track. the ocean was no longer an empty space to be pierced with a single, perfect course, but a grid to be methodically searched. This practice demanded supreme confidence in one's ability to find and hold a latitude. A mistake in that initial north-south measurement meant the entire expansion was wasted, and the search line would sail past the island with no second chance. It was a strategy born of humility in the face of the ocean's vastness, and a brilliant workaround for the one celestial question the stars themselves could not answer. It accepted the limitation of longitude not as a failure, but as a parameter of the journey, a puzzle to be solved not with a better clock, but with smarter, more patient geometry. The greatest library of the Pacific Ocean was never written down. In cultures without alphabets, where knowledge lived in breath and memory, the most complex navigational science on Earth was preserved through an elegant, living system of oral tradition. This was not a simple collection of stories, but a rigorously structured mnemonic technology designed to protect vital information across generations. At its heart were the chants and songs, rhythmic verbal maps that a navigator would internalize through years of repetition. These were not mere poems. They were precise algorithms set to melody. A single chant might encode the entire sequence of a voyage, listing in exact order the star bearings for each night, the names and behaviors of the ocean currents to be crossed, the species of seabirds that marked certain distances, and the distinctive cloud formations that hovered over the target island. By committing this chant to memory, the navigator carried within him a step-by-step guide. During the actual journey, he would mentally recite the chant, ticking off each segment as the stars confirmed it, using the rhythm to structure time and progress across the featureless sea. The melody itself served as a memory aid, the rise and fall of notes helping to lock sequences in place, turning abstract data into something felt and performed. This was knowledge as an active, participatory act, constantly rehearsed and renewed with each telling. But how do you map something as fluid and invisible as the ocean's swell? The people of the Marshall Islands developed one of the most ingenious solutions, the stick chart. These were not charts as we understand them, to be carried on a voyage. They were teaching tools crafted from the ribs of coconut palm fronds and small cowrie shells, tied together with fine fiber. The shells represented islands. The curved and straight sticks, however, did not represent literal travel routes. Instead, they mapped the ocean's energy, the refraction patterns of the swells as they wrapped around islands and atolls. A master navigator would construct a chart, a meadow for a specific archipelago, or a more comprehensive rebelib for a larger chain. He would bend and position the sticks to show how the dominant swell from the east would bend north and south as it encountered land, creating interference patterns and zones of calm called bot that could be felt far out at sea. A student would sit with the chart in his lap, running his fingers along the sticks, feeling the pathways of the waves. He was learning to decode the ocean's tactile language, to translate the abstract grid of sticks into the specific sensations his canoe would later experience. The chart was a physical model of an invisible force, a way to see with the hands what the eyes could not. After the lesson, the chart might be dismantled, its knowledge now transferred into the student's mind and body. These systems, the chant and the chart, formed a complete educational package. One captured the linear sequence of a journey through time and stars, the other captured the spatial and sensory reality of the sea's movement. Together, they allowed a non-literate culture to not only preserve staggeringly complex information, but to teach the nuanced art of synthesis, of weaving together all the threads of evidence into that single, unshakable sense of place on the open ocean. The sea's whispers could sometimes turn to silence or worse, to lies. For all its sophistication, this ancient art of wayfinding existed in a constant dialogue with peril. The system was robust, but it was never perfect, and its failures were written in the quiet stories of voyages that did not return. The greatest threat often came from the sky itself, in the form of prolonged bad weather. A week of solid overcast, a POC as Pacific navigators called it, could completely blank out the celestial map. Without the sun by day or the stars by night, the navigator's primary reference frame vanished. He was forced to rely solely on dead reckoning, steering by the feel of the wind and swell. But winds shift during storms, and swells can become confused. Each day of sailing blind introduced small errors into his mental calculation, errors that compounded with terrifying speed. He might believe he was still on course, while in reality the storm winds had pushed him dozens of miles off track. This was the nightmare scenario known as overstanding, where a vessel sails right past its destination, missing it completely in the vastness. Imagine searching for that specific house on the dark street, but a fog rolls in and you misjudge your steps. You walk right past your door, continuing on into the unknown darkness beyond. For a ship at sea, there was no simple turning back. Once an island was overstood, the crew faced a desperate choice: continue sailing into the void on dwindling supplies, or attempt a complex, uncertain return against the very winds and currents that had carried them astray. Unusual currents posed another silent, insidious danger. A navigator expected certain flows based on season and location, but an unexpected current, generated by a distant storm or an anomalous weather pattern, could act like a hidden river within the ocean, pulling the ship sideways without any visible sign on the surface. The crew might feel they were making good speed, the wind steady in the sail, while beneath them this invisible hand was dragging them inexorably off their intended line of latitude. By the time the error was discovered, perhaps when a familiar star failed to rise at its expected spot, it could be too late to correct without a dangerous, supply-burning detour. These losses were the shadow side of this grand human achievement. They remind us that this was not a magic formula, but a profound skill practiced by courageous individuals in an unforgiving element. Each successful landfall was a victory against uncertainty, and each vanished canoe a sobering lesson etched into the collective memory of the culture, making the surviving knowledge that much more precious, refined, and resilient. For centuries, the stories of these epic voyages lived in the realm of legend and scholarly debate. How could we be certain, skeptics asked, that these cultures truly accomplished such feats without modern instruments? The proof, however, was not lost to the waves. It lay waiting in the ground and in the very words spoken across thousands of miles. Archaeology began to provide the first hard evidence. On remote Pacific islands, digs uncovered stone adzes whose chemical signatures matched quarries in Hawaii, proving a return voyage against the prevailing winds was not only possible but practiced. The spread of the sweet potato, a crop native to South America, found in prehistoric sites across Polynesia, hinted at contact far beyond the archipelago. Most compelling, however, was the silent testimony of language. The spread of the Austronesian language family, from Madagascar off the coast of Africa all the way to remote Rapa Nui, maps a family tree of human movement. The subtle variations in words for canoe, star, and ocean current form a linguistic trail of breadcrumbs, tracing the paths of exploration and settlement across millennia. These clues painted a convincing picture, but the ultimate validation required putting theory into practice on the open ocean. In the 1970s, a daring project was born in Hawaii, not in a university lab but on a beach. The goal was to build a traditional Polynesian voyaging canoe, the Hokulea, and sail it from Hawaii to Tahiti using only the ancient methods without charts, compass, or sextant. The voyage would be led by a Micronesian master navigator, Maupiailug, who carried the knowledge of the star compass in his mind. Skeptics predicted failure or worse. Yet, after a month at sea, navigating by stars, swells, and birds, the Hokulea made landfall in Tahiti with stunning accuracy. The crew, many of whom were learning as they sailed, had not just completed a journey, they had resurrected a living science. This was not a one-time stunt. The Hercules and other replica vessels have since crisscrossed the Pacific, reaching New Zealand, Japan, and even circling the globe, each voyage a powerful testament. They proved beyond any doubt that the ancient system was not just theoretically sound, but brilliantly, reliably effective. It was a rediscovery that did more than validate the past. It reawakened a cultural pride and a profound connection to the sea, demonstrating that the greatest instrument for exploration was, and always has been, the human mind trained by generations of careful observation. So where does this leave the magnetic compass? Its arrival did not instantly erase the ancient arts of wayfinding. For a very long time, it was simply another tool in the box, a curious and sometimes temperamental one at that. Its true revolution was not in replacing celestial navigation, but in changing who could do it. The compass democratized the open sea. Before its widespread use, the ability to cross an ocean was locked within a small, elite class of master navigators. These individuals were the living libraries of their cultures, possessing a synthesis of knowledge that took decades to acquire. Their skills were rare, precious, and irreplaceable. The compass, for all its wobbles and deviations, offered something radically new: consistency. It provided a constant directional reference that was not dependent on clear skies, a calm swell, or perfect memory. A sailor on a cloudy night, even one with only a few years of experience, could now look at that trembling needle and know, with reasonable certainty, which way his bow was pointing. He could maintain a course for dead reckoning when the stars had vanished for a week. This reliability lowered the barrier to entry. It meant that larger fleets could be coordinated, with multiple ships following the same bearing even in poor weather. It meant a merchant captain from Genoa or Lisbon could train a crew in fundamental navigation without requiring every helmsman to be a master of the stars. The compass standardized the most basic element of the journey, direction, turning it from an art of profound intuition into a measurable, teachable skill. This shift in accessibility was the quiet catalyst for everything that followed. It enabled the age of global exploration, not because it was more accurate than a Polynesian star compass. It often was not, but because it allowed a broader range of people, ships, and nations to venture farther with greater confidence. The compass turned the specialized, lifelong wisdom of the few into a shared, portable tool for the many, setting the stage for the connected world we know today. The ancient navigator was not merely a captain giving orders. He was the central processor of a living, breathing system. Every element we have explored, from the star compass to the feel of the swell, was not a separate trick but a single, integrated data stream flowing into his consciousness. His mind was the organic computer, and his body was the primary sensor array. He felt the canoe's lift and slide through the soles of his feet, translating that motion into information about current and speed. His skin registered shifts in wind direction and humidity. His eyes scanned a 360-degree dome, tracking cloud color, bird behavior, and the precise ascent of stars. His ears filtered the sounds of the sea, listening for the distant thunder of a reef or the change in the water's rush along the hull. All of this raw, real-time environmental data was continuously fed into his mental model, the memorized chart of star paths, swell patterns, and sailing chants. His genius lay in the synthesis, in the constant cross-referencing. If the stars said one thing but the swell felt different, he knew to search for a hidden current or a storm over the horizon. He was running a continuous verification loop, comparing expectation against sensation, and adjusting his course not by a rigid rule, but by the weighted consensus of a dozen natural clues. The vessel itself was the perfect hardware for this software. Its design was not accidental. The Polynesian double hull provided the stable platform he needed for observation. The Norse longship's predictable handling gave him confidence in his dead reckoning. The ship was built to be readable, to respond to the ocean in a consistent way, so that every shudder and heel communicated clear information back to the navigator. This created a closed loop, a perfect feedback system. The ship enabled the journey, and the navigator, through his deep synthesis of knowledge, guided the ship. They were two parts of a whole. He did not conquer the ocean through brute force or a single magical tool. He succeeded by becoming a part of it, by integrating himself so completely into its rhythms that he could sense his position within an invisible grid. He was an analog computer made of flesh and memory, processing the language of the world in real time, turning the chaos of the open sea into a navigable and even welcoming space. This was their true innovation, a seamless fusion of human intuition, cultural memory, and tailored technology, a system so elegant that it allowed them to find a single island in an ocean of blue for generations. This integrated mastery of the world was not a mysterious, forgotten magic. It was a triumph of human ingenuity, a sophisticated toolkit assembled from the very fabric of nature. The ancient mariner's chart was written in starlight, his compass felt in the deep ocean swell, his calendar sung by the seasonal winds, and his landmarks announced by the flight of birds and the scent of distant land. Every voyage was a symphony of observation, where each sense played a part in a continuous, cross-check dialogue with the environment. They did not possess a single gadget that told them where they were. Instead, they cultivated a profound literacy, learning to read a world that was constantly speaking to them. This deep, experiential knowledge stands in stark contrast to our modern reality. Today, we tap a screen and trust a constellation of satellites and microchips to tell us, with digital certainty, our precise coordinates. We have outsourced that continuous dialogue to a device in our pocket. Yet the fundamental goal remains unchanged, a safe and purposeful passage across the unknown. It is worth pausing to consider the complex, invisible systems we now rely upon without full understanding. We trust the global positioning network, the internet, the electrical grid, with a faith that mirrors the ancient navigator's trust in the star path. His knowledge was built from a lifetime of direct experience with his tools, the sky and the sea. Our tools are layers of abstraction, brilliant yet opaque. Reflecting on their achievement invites a deeper appreciation for both ways of knowing, and a curiosity about what it means to truly find our way. To learn more about the living revival of these voyaging traditions, from the ongoing journeys of the Hokulia to the cultural knowledge preserved across the Pacific, explore the resources linked in the description below.